All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Legal Talk Week. I have completed my hostile takeover of this program. Nowadays we just declare victory over things, even if we don't accomplish anything. So I'm going to do that and plant my flag here. Anyway, my name is Victor Lee. I'm subbing for Bob Ambrosi this week, and I guess let's. Oh, so I'm assistant managing editor for the ABA Journal, and let's go around the horn. Let's start with you, Caroline.
Hi, thank you, Victor. Great to see you as our chair. Hi, Bob. Caroline Hill, editor-in-chief of Legal IT Insider, based over in the UK. Great to be here. Thanks.
And Steve, you're next on my Hollywood Squares.
Okay. Hi, I'm Steve Embry. I have the blog Tech Law Crossroads. I also write for Above the Law from time to time and Law Technology Today, which is ABA publication.
And then next I have is Rhys.
Muted.
You're muted, Rhys.
Sorry, Zoom. Hi, I'm Rhys. I'm the editor-in-chief of Legal Tech News. Just a heads up, we're going to change Legal Tech News to AI and stuff. It's going to be our new name. Just trying to keep on top of the changing industry.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, that's pretty much all we talk about now. Next, let's go with Joe.
Yeah, Joe Patrice. If you've listened to the show for a while, you know me from Above the Law of Legal Journalism. But I guess this is as good a place as any to announce some big news for me, a change. I am going to pivot from legal journalism to being a GPU as a service provider. I'm doing all. If shoe companies can give up their business to do it, I figure I can. So.
All right, well, we'll miss you, Joe. And then next is Niki Black.
Actually, I've changed my name to AI Black, so I just want to announce that. I'm the principal legal insight strategist at 8 a.m., the team behind My Case Law, Pay Case Peer, and DocketWise. I write legal technology columns for ABA Journal, Above the Law, and the Daily Record. And I also write 8 a.m.'s Legal Industry Report, which just came out last month. And I do expect everyone to start calling me. You can just call me like AI, but pull it together, and we'll be good. I'm good with that. So.
Yeah, that's fair. And then finally, Legora's new spokeswoman, Stephanie Wilkins.
Oh, I'm like, what am I doing now? Yes, no, I can. Yes, you can get me to shill for your company for far less than Jude Law, I'm guessing. But I am Stephanie Wilkins, director of content at Legal Tech Hub, and currently shilling for nobody but Legal Tech Hub.
And so that gives us the perfect segue to this week's big news, the one that we all are dying to talk about here. So Legora announced that Jude Law would be the face of law, which I thought was clever, a little obvious, but I think it works in this case. But basically, he's going to be the face of the company, and looks like they're making a pretty big expansion to other parts of the world and whatnot. But I want to get your take on this, Caroline, because look, obviously he's big over here, but I get the impression that in the UK he's basically like George Clooney and Brad Pitt over there. So I imagine this must be huge news over there.
It's huge. And every year we watch The Holiday, which I wrote when I wrote about this deal with Legora. I said I'm never going to be able to watch The Holiday again in the same light. It's huge, and it's fascinating because on one level, kudos to Legora. I shared with you all in advance of this panel a photo. I was walking through London Bridge, which is at one of our biggest stations, and sure enough, prime real estate. There it is, Legora, a Jude Law video, and it really blew me away. This is major. And speaking to somebody in marketing, he said that what Legora. So I wrote about it within the context of Legora and Harvey because as you've all written about or know about, they've also been paying big bucks. So they've gone with Harvey Specter. They've gone with everyone's paying a lot of money to big reps. They've Fulham Football Club. I think they've got some deal with Arsenal. People have seen their branding at Arsenal. And what they're trying to do is the VC playbook, which is that they sorry, I've got a child trying to distract me. They want to be the brand, right? So they want to be in everyone's conscience because I don't know. I mean, I can't wait to hear your take on this, but they want to be the brand, right? So they want to be in not just obviously law firms' consciousness, but in the corporates, the FTSE 100 and beyond, as like they, oh yeah, they're the ones that we use, right? So that it's a big play on becoming sort of synonymous, almost like someone described it as they want to become like the verb, like they want to become like the Hoover, when it comes to this sort of platform, which and that it takes a lot of doing and a lot of money. I'd be fascinated to hear your views on it as to whether you think it makes sense or anything really.
You lose your trademark protection if you do that.
Yeah, that's
You
true.
don't want to be the generic. Yeah.
It's like Kleenex right here.
Yeah, Kleenex it fights that. Velcro fights that. Yeah, they don't want to be known as that.
Interesting. Good
I
point.
thought it's interesting the holidays framing. Like I gather the internal code name for this was Alfie, or I think was that something that I read somewhere. Yeah,
Oh yeah, that's one of his movies. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, at least it wasn't a series of unfortunate events. So, see,
Well, yeah. Well, well, hopefully it's not unfortunate for them, but I mean, because I guess I mean we don't. I mean, I don't think we've spoken about Legora too much on the show. I mean, we've maybe a little bit, but not as much as some of the other big players. I mean, they were evaluated at 5.5 billion their last round. So I mean, they're not like nobody, obviously, and the fact that they could afford this guy. And they also made a deal with the New York Yankees and Aaron Judge. I don't know if this is
Mhm.
deliberate on their part. Bob actually wrote a post. I should probably link to that one. Bob wrote a post about how potentially other legal themed people with legal themed names that they could sign up after this. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we've seen the power of celebrity endorsements, and we've seen how it can, obviously boost the company's profile and whatnot. But it also makes you wonder, sort of like, I mean, do people really look at it and be like, oh, well, if Jude Law says Legora is great, then maybe I should get it from my firm? I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know.
I would sort of doubt that. I mean, uh, although it could just raise name recognition generally,
Yeah.
so that if you were a managing partner thinking about Legora, you might not care so much about Jude Law. You might care though that they have the stature and resources to get Jude Law. That might be more important. It would be to me.
And I mean,
I wouldn't.
and that's true of a lot of advertising. I don't really care that some celebrity drinks whatever, but like it does signal something.
Yeah.
His last name is Law. See, I assumed that they were doing this because he was in the movie AI as a prostitute.
I
He
thought it was because he was handsome, because that's all they seemed to talk about was that he was handsome. I thought
He
that's
was
the whole
people's
reason.
sexiest man alive back in, I think, 2000 something. Or, yeah.
he's still handsome. So it's not so
I
it's
was the
interesting
runner-up that year, by the way.
within
So.
the I bet you are. Within the corporates, like it's about that. So they're not just going for the legal, are they? With their shared spaces, they want the business. And I'm not suggesting that the business don't care about whether it's any good, but I think it makes the brand recognition makes their life much easier in terms of adoption. Like, oh, can we get Legora? Like they know the name, or whatever it
Mhm.
might be, or Harvey, if
Right.
they happen to have seen Harvey Specter or whatever. I think it's that it doesn't mean that the thing's any good or that they understand how it works even, but it's just that recognition of, oh yeah, we can get that, and somehow that makes the adoption easier, which advertising makes no sense on any level, does it? Like we know it doesn't, but it just gets into your psyche.
Like I get that, but I guess I do question. It's not like, I could still tell you Grant Hill drinks Sprite, but I'm as a regular consumer. Like their target audience are like, is a really sophisticated law firm or in-house department going to buy Legora over Harvey over any other company? I mean, you pick any of them because of a celebrity. Like I would hope that legal enterprise decisions are banking on things that are not that.
I,
We
I
seem
thought
to
this
have just
was.
a ton of cash to spend too. It's strange. Like I spoke to them and I spoke to Harvey too, and I always asked, like, you like have a ton of cash. How do you hope to spend the cash? And they keep telling us like we don't actually, need all the cash that we raise. And I'm like, okay, then why, like why do you have it? And I suppose it's just to, interact with Jude Law and celebrities. I mean, like they just have cash to kind of throw around, and they seem to just be really enjoying themselves too, to get people to like talk about them too. So like they have way more cash than they know what to do with. And if like I had that cash too, I would hire Jude Law for something as well, I have to say.
I mean, it goes to the big issue with the whole industry, and I think the legal tech side of the industry is better than the frontier provider side of it. But they're all selling more and more of their company for more and more cash with not the corresponding revenue stream to justify this valuation. And that's what worries me is like at a certain point, the bill comes due, and you're really banking a lot on, and I think this might be another story we talk about in a bit, but you're banking a lot on the valuation catching up. And it's got to be a risky time if that's what you're banking on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with what Steve said, sort of like this idea of like, well, you can look successful if you can reel someone in like a Jude Law or someone like, or like a team like the New York Yankees, or even with other companies like, Cleo and the Canucks, and then oh well, Niki's Tampa Bay Bucks. So there's all kinds of there are all kinds of these tie-ups happening when we talked about it on the show. Yeah, it definitely kind of shows that is one way of showing success, I guess. And so I get that part of it.
I guess we're talking
Although
about
I was
them,
just sitting here, sitting here thinking though it could actually backfire because there's some lawyers and legal professionals who would say these guys they don't even understand our business. I mean, they're not hiring these celebrities, has nothing to do with their product and what we do. Why would we go with them when they're throwing money away for nothing pertaining to what we do? So I'm not of that necessarily that school, but I could see people jump into that conclusion in the legal space.
And what's the law? Sorry.
I did forget to announce I bought the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, so I had some money laying around. No, it was not me. My company A8AM partnered with them. I did want to say the one thing that one of my favorite things to come of the Jude Law thing, and I don't know if y'all saw this. Some company I'd never heard of very quickly posted a video in response, Claren Law, which made me laugh. I don't know if I can put it in the chat, but
I was trying to find that. I could never find it again. That's the one I was referring to. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was such a great response. And they seemed to be lucky that they had a co-founder who was equally on par with Jude Law. I thought, I don't know how they managed that, but it was, they did a great job getting that video up. I thought that was super, not only really fast, it was high quality, and it was, they did a really good job with it. So
that's the beauty of AI now, right?
Sorry?
Yeah.
That's the beauty of AI now. You can make these videos fast.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Caroline.
Sorry. Going back to Steve's point about people thinking, should they be spending this money? I spoke to a customer about some of this marketing. It was actually a while ago when we had the Harvey Spectre. They weren't really aware of it. So I was like, well, I don't know if that's a sign of anything, but with this newest announcement with Jude Law, I spoke to this guy in marketing, Simon Marshall, TBD marketing, and he was saying, what people really want to be reassured of is that it's secure, that they're investing in the governance, that it works, and it's quite funny because you guys sometimes take the mickey out of my British expressions, and I concluded. He said, they need to make sure that they can pat their heads and rub their mes at the same time. I don't know if that translates.
Yeah, it does. It does.
American thing too, yeah.
So they're
not as easy as it sounds. It's not as easy as it sounds.
I was going to say I'm not sure I can do it, but I understand the concept.
If Bob's not here, I think we should all just spend the rest of the time giving it a go. But
so long as you start one before the other, it's actually easy. But you can't do them at the same time. If I were a company, I will say of like the Suits thing, and I said this about the Suits thing. Suits apparently was a deal for people who are into law, but like not my generation. And I've reached a point, sadly, where I might be the generation of people making decisions in law firms. So Jude Law, not anything really legal related other than his name. If I were one of these companies, not to give free legal advice, legal marketing advice, but if you're going to go this route, I don't understand why a dump truck full of money hasn't gone to Joe Pesci yet. Like, if you're trying to talk to
Yeah.
people who are my age, who are decision makers in law firms, like, that is absolutely where I would be sending that money. I don't know.
I mean, there are
Oh, Joe,
multiple
you didn't
Vinnies.
hear Joe. The reason Bob's not here is he's
Oh,
negotiating with Joe to be a sponsor for our, yeah.
for this show? Okay.
Hey,
Oh, weren't we going to offer ourselves as sponsors to anybody? Like, for the right amount of money?
Yeah, they'll send me my $2 royalty check in any day now. But yeah, but then I want to pivot, I guess, to Stephanie's story talking about just legal tech funding in general. When you talk about this and just sort of like, just like it kind of piggybacks off this, just all the money that's flowing in.
Yeah, I kind of figured I would be up next. Yeah, so this is my own official tracking. So I mean, there might be a few things that I missed, but I sat down, I started tracking funding announcements the very beginning of 2025, and I've kept it going. So I did this article that compared what we saw for 2025 as a full year compared to Q1 2026 to see where we're on track. And again, fairly thorough, but this is not my full-time job to track funding, so there might be a few rounds missing here and there. But yeah, so given the way the math is mathing, we're set to outpace 2025, which was a crazy year for funding. We were about 2.3 billion, or sorry, 4.3 billion in 2025, and we're at 1.4 at the end of Q1. There's been more that have come in since then. And so, if you do that math, that's 5.6, is it, or something like that, for what we're on pace for this year, assuming it holds. And I mean, I know we've had huge rounds in both years that are somewhat outliers, but it's still an outlier if you have outliers every year. And then, yeah, I don't really know why. I mean, we'll see if it holds, but it's just getting bigger and it's growing. And but 4 companies, if you take out of that 15-month period, there were 4 companies that got over half that funding, and it was Harvey, Legora, Clio, and Filevine.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it's pretty significant. I started crunching numbers, and this will be a different article, but I will give you guys a very depressing preview of this. That 15-month period, about 4% of this total went to companies with at least one female founder. So yeah, it's coming out to something like 19% of the rounds, but 4% of the funding. That's just my very initial. I have to do more, meaning the rounds they're getting are smaller. Yeah, that's the way that we're starting. But yeah, which is like what we've seen in past years. And again, that's just my very initial. I have to dig in more to make sure those numbers are right. But so yeah, that'll be a depressing article I'll write after this, but still holding true. But yeah, tons and tons of funding and ramping up as we go.
Yes, I'm not surprised by that. I hate to sound like that, but I'm not surprised by that.
Oh no, I'm not surprised either. Like I mean, I expected to be depressed when I started doing the math. Yes.
I'd be interested in seeing, do you have data that, you don't have data that predates AI, do you, like generative AI?
No, I haven't. No, this is all stuff that I started doing just on my own after I got here. So no, but I might do. I mean, as I get into that as an article, I might do more like digging and research. I don't know how deep my article will go or how easy it is to find that data, but I'll look into that.
Well, I'm curious if if it's with AI, it's become even more. I mean, we've always known women historically,
Yeah.
In tech and in the legal tech space have gotten less, women-owned companies have gotten less funding. But I wonder if it's even worse comparatively with generative AI, because it seems like AI has just been, has amplified that problem even more. But I don't really have data to back it up. It's just my gut.
Do you have access
the other
to it? Sorry, Rhys. I know like a few years ago, Cassandra did a similar, just on her own calculation. And I think it was equally pretty low. I don't know. It was about the gender divide, or it was something about like an old boys club in the title or something. I don't know if you could find it, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can probably find it.
Okay.
I would also be interested, and I mean, would be a good thing to know as you guys suggest, but I wonder if the advent of the AI tools have dramatically increased the funding overall from what it was before. That might be an interesting statistic as well.
Yeah.
Whether this balloon in funding is in part due to the somehow connected with AI development.
The only silver
What actually
lining I
seems
could.
like, oh,
No,
I'm so sorry.
no, go for it.
Okay. What actually seems like, there's only like Harvey, Clio, Filevine, and Legora 2, and they are just blowing people out in terms of the funding. I mean, like Harvey almost had a billion in 2025, and that is unheard of. Like I recall when the CLM space became like huge, like around 2021, 2022, and we all, saw that I recall it was like Ironclad had like raised 150 mil, and we were all like, that is insane. And they're just, raising 200 mil rounds like every, 3, 4 months, whatever. So like it's changed where like there's like 4 players at the top, and then a tiny like sprinkle of cash to like everyone else who have to compete for all that cash. There's also an explosion of startups on the scene too. So it's interesting. Like while the uh, funding overall has like exploded, like it's probably harder to like if you're a startup to like have that type of like funding too, just due to like everyone else in the industry and the focus on like the 4 like 5 huge big players at the top.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, Stephanie, is like because like I'm looking at the graphic,
Mhm.
and it's like you have this huge line for 2025 full year for practice management, and then this year there's nothing so far. It's just because you have those giants in practice management that are kind of established, and there's really no room for anybody else.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, I made that comment in there, and that I mean, so practice management was such a huge category last year, and that is because, I mean, Clio alone with the 850 million, and then Filevine. So it'll be interesting to see. And I had to make some calls about how to categorize things because, like, I firmly categorize Clio as practice management, but going forward, will we? I don't know. They could arguably be an AI legal assistant category now. They have all the things, but I made that call, right? Um, yeah, so I think that's going to be, I mean, I think that's going to be a huge outlier for last year because of that. But also then like this year, you're seeing ramp up in places like I've started including AI law firms in there, and that there was a couple raises last year, and then I think they're going to be the funding darling of this year. So it's interesting to see. On the women founders thing, though, even within that, I want to say, I mean, I haven't done the math, but it's probably at least like a third of that, of all of the funding going to women founders, probably I think went to GCAI. They had they had one really big round, but they had 2 significant funding rounds with, Cecilia Zanidi is the founder of that, and she's one of the only female founding companies that are making, the $70,000 raises or things like that. So, yeah, it's
More.
yeah.
Yeah, even more. Yeah,
I mean, like in a single raise.
oh yeah. All right.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say I was gonna say one thing, which was one of the potential, not silver linings, but not things to make it feel a little bit better is that there are a lot of when I like tour tech shows, a lot of the tech companies that are women founded tend to be it's a carryover from legal, tend to be somebody who is a lawyer who has a practice area that they're porting over like a really focused product for that theoretically doesn't need as much money as a huge gobbler like a Harvey or whatever. So that might help a little bit. I was thinking because like I'm thinking about like the Hello Divorces and stuff like that. Like they don't need like that kind of amount, but it's because they're like practitioners in a space. Then they just like they got a thing they can do it real quick and whatever.
Well,
was
and
my
you
one.
see,
Yeah.
yeah, and you see a lot more female founders in the B2C space and A to J space, which I've included in
Yeah,
here, but obviously they're just a fraction of the total funding going on out
of
there.
course.
You survey that space, there's so many more female founders in those areas. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've done.
But the one other thing I was just going to say real quick, and this will set up the next thing probably, which is, you know what wasn't in any of the, about the big financial news? IPOs. Didn't see much of those. Saw lots of people collecting more money, not a lot of people paying off more money.
Yeah. Well, and interesting just on the relativity note too, because that's the most recent IPO we heard. Like I chose not I did not include relativity's debt refinancing as funding. I put a note in there
Okay.
because I included, and some people have, I included Clio's debt facility, but not relativity's debt financing, because one is actual new capital coming in that can be put towards things, whereas one is not adding any new capital whatsoever. So that's why I did not include the relativity number in there, in case anyone's wondering.
The other thing I just want to mention when it comes to looking at the investment into the industry is that there's a significant portion of investment that's relatively invisible and can't be tracked, which is the PE investment. PE companies don't announce their investment. It's quiet. They get multiple backers, and they get new investment, and oftentimes it rivals the venture capital loud announcements, but there's no way to track it because PE companies and venture capital companies approach their PR and their the way that they manage things very differently. So there's no way to track it, but there's actually a lot more money coming in than is even reflected there.
Sure.
So then,
like
so this segue might need some work, and this is why I'm not the usual host. So you did talk about AI law firms in there, so let's go to Rhys's story about the AI native law firm.
Don't apologize. Bob makes it up as he goes
Cool.
along.
But you didn't give the classic Bob kind of smirk when you did that.
Hey, I'm still working on it. All right.
So before I hop into this story, I was just hoping to add one more thing on the prior conversation. The advertisement from Legora could be tailored to VCs and private equity firms as opposed to like attorneys. They just want people to know that they're huge, and they want investors to feel like, oh, we should, throw cash at this company because we don't want FOMO, and they're so large they got Jude Law. Let's actually spend some time to understand who they are and stuff. So it could be, if you have cash, you can get more cash too, and it just is a snowball type of effect. Anyway, on to the AI law firm. So folks from Casetex and TR, and also a few big law firms such as Fenwick and Cooley, have started a AI law firm, where they essentially, tend to automate a ton of the operations that a firm has with agentic and AI. And they essentially hope to, start off by focusing on contracting service for clients in the West Coast in Silicon Valley. And these, new types of AI first and hybrid, firms too, are actually, kind of growing in the industry. And it really comes down to people saying okay, law firms, have access to the tech, except they're slow to really change their operations. They're slow to change their pricing, and they're really slow to give clients the kind of cost savings that clients are asking for too. And it really comes down to folks who say that law firms are just incapable of changing at a pace which the industry requires because they're so tied to the old way and the billable hour. It's actually helps people to say that it's time to build something new from scratch. I've actually spoken to a few of these firms and a few startups too in the legal research space too. And the stuff that I hear is always the same. It's like, like these, established players in the industry, don't have, the approach to really meet the moment. And all they're trying to do is take AI and place it on top of a old approach that is completely completely like incompatible. It's like, the stuff that the industry is asking for. And so like we should start from scratch and build new firms, build new tech startups from scratch around agentic and AI. And that seems to be like happening in the law firm space where we're seeing like hybrid firms too, like Norm Law and Udia Council, and a few others too, who are like, we can do the stuff that like law firms do, except we can do it way better, and actually, like cater to clients' needs. And it seems to be a growing trend. The question I have is like how large, how tiny potentially, like of a threat do these new firms pose to the established players in the industry?
It's
Yeah,
a really
I was wondering.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say it's a really interesting question because I started looking at some of these too, and I mean, obviously the big firms are going to say it's not, and obviously the AI law firms are going to say it is. But I really do think, I mean, it's just to me, it's a step even further. We've had this billable hour conversation, and I'm always the negative Nelly on it. That's like no one's going to ever give that up. It's going to take longer than we want it to. But things like this are really going to push the conversation even further and faster, I think. So, I mean, yeah, you're not. I mean a lot of them are starting with contracts, like because it's easy, right? So I mean, I don't think we're at risk of them upsetting a DLA Piper tomorrow, but yeah, it's gonna be it's gonna really push the question of value, I think.
They're really
Right.
optimistic. I was chatting with Stella Legal, who many of you will know, with Tyson Ballard, and they acquired an ALSP, and he said to me just this week, he said he thinks that the next Magic Circle firm will be like an AI first or a kind of a new firm. We were all on the record, so I'm not being, I'm going to write about it hopefully soon. He's like I'm coming for their lunch, like they. I think the new players, I mean, it's easier said than done, right? To get to that sort of size when you're sort of talking about a magic circle. But I feel like there's this sense of, the constraints, the culture, the difficulties around really, really pushing change in an institution that has existed based on it's not been transformative in the way that it operates. I think they are transforming. Some of the firms that we work with are transforming. They're trying, but it's a massive challenge culturally.
Yeah.
And
It's almost insurmountable. I mean, it's when you consider, I mean, the law firms, not only it's a business model, but it's the entire culture from how you advance to how you get compensated, and making that shift. I mean, if you want to have associates that work on matters that are billed in an alternative fashion, they're going to say, well, why would I do that? Because my advancement hinges on my hours, and you want me to work less hours to make more profit on the alternative fee structure. I mean, the whole thing becomes, pretty hard to push over the line. I do think this is a little bit akin and related to the rise of remote only law firms, where almost all the lawyers work remotely and there is no central office. Some of the similar concepts, and you take those two together, and it may end up with firms that challenge the traditional law firms these firms are now AI only and totally remote because they don't have the cultural constraints that all the big firms do.
Hey, Rhys, I had a question. Did they talk? I mean, I might have missed it just reading, but like, did they talk at all about like what kind of savings that they were able to get and whether that did reflect their fees and their fee structures and things like that?
They haven't. They're actually fairly new. They just launched in December. So we'll probably have a conversation with them at the end of 2026 just to see like how it's all panned out. I mean, like it's strange because all these like hybrid and these AI firms have just really started to come out like in 2025 and 2026. And it's interesting because like people were kind of scared off of like the hybrid firm due to Atrium. And I believe it was 2017 and then they closed in 2020, if I remember right. And people are like, yeah, like the hybrid firm thing is just, like not going to be something we could do. Like I think with all the changes in tech, there's a whole new, rush probably to come up with new law firm structures. And the crazy thing with, that also like struck me was like, you know, folks were pretty convinced that like huge firms cannot change. Like it was a whole entire let's tear stuff down and start from scratch type of approach. And like the large firms I've talked to are like, we can change and we are changing, and we're doing stuff like lockstep so people don't feel so tied to the old way too. And people have the time to, to try out these tools, so like it really comes down to the question of like, do we have to tear everything down and start from scratch? Or can the industry really adapt? And it's hard for like, firms that have, like that are just old as hell to change. And they like haven't had to change for so long too. I mean, it's crazy how much change like firms have had just since 2020, although like compared to other industries, like it's, a tiny blimp, I feel.
I think what's helping them, so that in order to really change, they have to understand value and they have to move to sort of value-based billing and all of this kind of stuff. And I think that they've had lack of full visibility over even the bigger firms of how their time is being spent and what value really means. And I do think that there's improvements in technology that are enabling them to have greater visibility across the entire firm to start to really understand where value comes from. And maybe just briefly on that point. So I think it's important to remember, I know we all know Radiant Law. So there have been firms, back in the day so Radiant was founded by Alex Hamilton, ex Latham and Watkins, and they never had the billable hour, and they've always operated on a value-based billing model. And it's really, really cool seeing some of the stuff he's doing. And they've automated the hell out of absolutely everything, worked with some really big corporates. Obviously they're rewarded by efficiency. So I think it's kind of, some of the stuff that these new firms are doing isn't brand new. I think sometimes we think everything is new, but obviously there are firms that are doing this and have done it really successfully.
We also can't forget too that there always will be a place for the billable hour type work. The bet the company kind of case where the value of the case is so high that who cares whether you're efficient or not. And in fact, if I were an in-house counsel, I'm not sure I would want you to be efficient. I would want you to work, leave no stone unturned, do everything that needs to be done. And how do I incentivize that? Well, I pay you by the hour, of course. So yeah, there's always going to be that. And some of the largest firms, that's their bread and butter in many ways. That's what they do. So expecting them to change with that kind of client and matter mix is maybe unrealistic to some extent.
Well, that's a good point. I had never thought about this, but the clients that would sometimes be the most challenging to deal with were it's the principle of the matter. And you're, all right, fine, the principle of the matter, like you don't, why would you take that on value-based billing? They're going to want you to, and I'm thinking more traditional litigation clients, but it's the same thing. They want you to just make the other person's life incredibly difficult and punish them
Right.
for whatever it is that the perceived wrong that has happened. And you're like, fine, then if you want to do that, as long as it's ethical for me to do this, yeah, you can pay me all you want. I'll bill you by the hour. Like, why would you want to take that on a value-based billing? Because their goal is to, as things go along, make things more difficult for the other side, not easier, or not to get it done with quickly. Their goal is to cause pain. And again, those are the cases you have to decide, is this ethical to even be bringing it? But, that's a
And
situation.
Well, yeah, but that's when you see
we
like the
always had a
boxes and
saying
boxes.
about those, but had a saying about those kind of people. It's a matter of principle until they get the first bill.
100%.
That's when you see that's when you see like the truck backing up with like all those boxes and boxes of discovery. It's like, all right, you want everything? Here you go. But yeah, let's because actually there's a lot of stuff on the sheet this week. A lot of things. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them. But let's a tool that lawyers can use if they want to integrate AI into their practice is Claude Legal, and it is here now. And Niki, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I wrote this article because one of the things that what I did is it was sort of a little bit of a pretty broad overview of a how-to for um, Claude Legal. I like to sort of let my readers know what's happening that are not necessarily in the legal tech loop, and also just sort of give them a quick roadmap on how to get there. So that was what half of this was, but then the other half was um, I one of the things I'm particularly interested in to see what happens this year is what does the end structure end up looking like? Like who wins, legal tech or big tech? And how does this kind of funnel into our industry? And my experience with Claude Legal was really interesting. So I had a mid-page account because I met with them at mid-page AI, is a AI legal research tool. And I had met with them at Legal Week, and they gave me free access to their account. And I'd also recently switched from ChatGPT to Claude, and so I had a Claude account. So I added the Claude Legal in skill, I think it's a skill, and then connected it with MidPage. And what I found was I did some research using one of the so there's a particular search I always run. Um, and I describe it in the article, but it had to do with a case years ago when I was a young associate that I had the hardest time finding a comparable case because the language that was used to describe the accident that led to the injuries was so generic. So basically, our client was driving down the highway. There was a microburst of wind, kind of like not a tornado, but a major sudden burst of wind that took a road sign that was presumably loose because it just flew into the air like one of those exit 54 and decapitated the person driving in the seat. The dog was in the front seat. For some reason, the family was in the back seat, and only the husband was killed. And so, it was presumably a state-owned sign. We hadn't done discovery, but my job initially was just to kind of assess liability and also statutory filing deadlines and that type of thing. And it was so hard. It took me 5 or 6 hours using natural language to locate similar cases because, road sign, street, automobile, projectile, like they're all such generic words. And so there were cases where like signs flew over and landed on somebody that were like weighted with cement, or just all these other types of cases that were kind of similar but not really. And it took me so long to find a few comparable cases at the time. And so I always come back to this case when I try to test legal research tools, especially as they advance, because to see how quickly can they identify it. So when I use one of the big two research tools AI functionality recently, and I conducted that research, and it did took very quickly found some cases, and then I used MidPage on its own with its own LLM versus Claude acting as the researcher, and it came up with some similar responses to the one of the big two. They gave me the case. I found some similar cases very quickly, far more quickly, 10 minutes rather than a couple of hours. But then when I did the same thing with Claude as the researcher, if you will. As I understand it, it's kind of akin to a different person using this, similar databases to conduct the research. And what what Claude did as it conducted the research using MidPage's database was not only did it find the best cases really fast. It also provided me with a bunch of information I didn't ask for. It alerted me to the deadline, the drop dead statutory deadlines for court of claims cases when you're filing a case against New York. And then it also offered up, and something when I went and delivered this research to the partner who had 30 years litigation experience, whereas I had like 6 at that point. The partner said, we're going to need to identify this witness, this other, an expert for this, someone who is familiar with state inspection requirements for signs, and this other, and Claude said, you're going to have to find these witnesses, by the way, to prove your case, assuming that you have to determine it's owned by the state, and then you're going to have to, and so Claude, and I didn't have that as a 6-year associate. I litigated a lot, I'd done many trials and hearings, hundreds at that point, as a public defender, and then I'd been in this civil litigation firm for a while, but I had never handled a court of claims case just because I hadn't, and I'd never dealt with road signs and the need to inspect them, but this partner who had practiced for 30 years had encountered these things and knew that they were hurdles that you would have to cross. And Claude was able to provide all that information in 10 minutes, and it was a far superior result. So I was incredibly impressed with the output of Claude against a database. And so it was, to me, an example of how that Claude as the harness may be, against any kind of legal database, or the conduit into the business, because I think that practice management is still going to be a thing. I think legal research is going to be a thing. I think document management, because each of those companies knows how to specifically handle the data, address compliance issues, understands the workflows. But I think that you may end up having this Claude as the top that is the conduit into the tools, that whatever the tools the firm is using, and Claude may sometimes be able to take those and combine them and provide the exact answer you're looking for across your firm's database, across the other, practice resources. So I think it was just an interesting example of how effective that might potentially be. So that was my article.
Oh, it's interesting. I spoke to the mid-age people last week, and they essentially told me that, like, their whole approach is to just have it on Claude, because they think that Claude will be the platform that attorneys go to first, and that's how they stand out against the TRs and the Lexuses too. And I it was such a curious statement too, because I had no expertise, and I was completely unsure too, on Claude. And I will say, the experience that you had tends to really drive their thesis home. And Claude seems to power everything anyway. It seems to be the one thing that always tends to be everywhere. So potentially we could see folks just going to a ChatGPT and Claude and having it as the first contact. And if we do, it could entirely reshape the entire tech industry and be an extremely scary prospect too, for a ton of people who spent a long time trying to construct these platforms and design these platforms for the industry, just to have a chat tool take it over. I mean, it's a crazy prospect, although it is a prospect that I feel is potentially going to happen to an extent. And it could start a whole transformation in the industry. I mean, it is quite scary if I was at a legal tech provider, I guess.
I've thought the same thing for a while as well. Absolutely.
The other thing I wanted to mention is I've used Claude's legal skill for compliance work on the winery side of things, because my husband and I are starting a winery, and it's been incredibly helpful for that in terms of understanding the compliance requirements and understanding deadlines, and that's what it's designed for. So I've also used it in that context, and it's been really valuable and saved me a ton of time.
Yeah, I
How
think
would you
there
compare it
was
to like a
this.
chat GPT or something? Because I mean, so many people, I mean, we've seen the stats. So many people just use chat GPT as sort of the default now. How would you compare it to something like that?
Well, I used ChatGPT up until I switched, and I think that Claude on its own without the legal skill is comparable to ChatGPT. I would not use it for the compliance stuff, for example, on the winery side of things. But when you add that legal skill in there, it already has some of that guardrailing and, a lot of the stuff done on the back end that makes it particularly useful for that. So it's the legal skill, I think, that is what makes it stand out in that respect. And again, did I did I double check what it was telling me even in that context? Of course I did. Did I 100% rely on it? No, but it saved me a ton of initial research and framed the issues in terms of the compliance stuff that I needed to know for the winery, so that I could sort through that a little easier because I have no familiar. I definitely have never handled that type of thing as an attorney.
Gotcha. All right.
Pretty
Well, yeah,
impressive.
we still have a couple stories we got to talk about, so I'm just gonna zoom through. So, let's go to you, Steve. Let's talk about lawsuits because I guess that's
Yeah.
similar.
Well, it's
I was
not
trying to come up
really.
with something. I was like, yeah, let's just do it.
Well, this story wasn't really legal tech necessarily, but it is. I think it's some fascinating developing issues. So we all probably heard about the verdict against Meta for negligently designing a system that would lead to addiction of social media or use of the social media, and they're pretty substantial. And then I read this story about some lawyers in Florida who are claiming that they're going to file a suit against OpenAI. But they represent the victim of a shooter, and their claim is that that OpenAI, ChatGPT, gave the shooter the know-how to do the crime. And their claim, in part, is that uh, ChatGPT is a product that's defectively designed and creates an unreasonable risk of danger. So product liability concepts apply, which is now would be strict liability, would not have to prove negligence. And as a old product liability lawyer, I sort of wonder about that because, I mean, is it a product or is it providing a service to its users? It's so typically products are products like, a car or a lawnmower or what have you. And that would be sort of extending it a bit in my mind to something that's not typically been considered a product, but maybe that's not, that unreasonable. Of course, there's all sorts of intervening and superseding cause issues and that'll be in the case. So I'm not really sure how valid it'll be. I mean, it's hard to typically intervening superseding cause, and I've had cases that dealt with that issue. Crimes are typically considered intervening superseding cause because they're not considered foreseeable. But I think we're going to see a whole lot of these cases as plaintiffs' lawyers sort of, see an opportunity here to bring these kinds of claims. And the verdict potential is obviously maybe not what it is, and some of the other well-known uh, product cases, but it is substantial and it's just beginning. And so, it could be a burgeoning legal area that we see, more class actions. We start to see some multi-district litigation and a lot of interesting kind of stuff here. So it'd be interesting to see how it develops.
I'll say a quick thing. It's insane in the article, and I believe it's the right article I have. It's they said that ChatGPT gave the gunman advice on how to carry out a attack. I cannot even ask ChatGPT to create a photo that has a cartoon character due to content restriction.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure how people,
Yeah,
are doing this on
it is
ChatGPT. I
interesting.
think the content, that's
The,
completely out of
the,
whack with the
the
restrictions.
claim, their claim seems to be that the chatbot ought to be able to figure out where you're going when you ask it certain things, and when it sees that, provide a warning to prevent you from going any further. But you're right. I mean, I don't get very far with, I mean, I haven't asked it how to go shoot somebody. Granted, I'll put that right up front, but there are things that I ask it. But as we all know, there are workarounds for a lot of that stuff if you're crafty enough.
It'd be interesting.
So
I don't know this case, but it'd be interesting to know whether there's an element of it, whether it was encouraging, because obviously, you can get information on this sort of stuff anywhere on the internet, right? Like there's the
yeah,
internet cesspit of it's not just ChatGPT. You can get this kind of sort of advice or information anywhere. You could go to the dark web and get someone killed. I feel like, but I feel like maybe the active nature, perhaps, you've heard of ChatGPT encouraging people to do something, and I think that maybe would be a different thing. If you've heard awful examples of ChatGPT encouraging people to commit suicide and things like that. I wonder if that may be a slight differentiator in the active nature of the advice.
That was
yeah.
exactly
There
my
used to be some of these cases. They were terrorist bombing cases where the claim would be that you could go online and learn how to make a bomb pretty easily, and the makers of the material should have known that and provided some sort of warning or done something differently. But that's different. I mean, that was a physical product as opposed to claiming that Google would give you clues on how to blow up a building, and therefore Google is a product manufacturer subject to product liability law. That seems a bit of a stretch. I mean,
that was exactly my initial gut reaction too. I also am not being fully familiar with either of the cases, but like the encouragement factor, like we've read the Google cases where the chatbot was actively saying like, yeah, maybe you should take your own life, as opposed to here's like the anarchist cookbook has been out there forever, and as far as I know, the writer has not been put in jail for this. So it's like to me, it's a little bit it's different, but I don't know. Somewhere the line does have to be drawn, and I'm not suggesting where that is, but I feel it's different too.
I mean, I think it goes to a lot of the conversation more broadly that we're having of these now lawmakers trying to dismantle Section 230 too. Like a lot of what the internet is based on is the idea that no, you are not liable for what idiots do with what you put up there. And even though this is, this product liability argument is different, it's a broader theme. We've got politicians trying to score quick points on maybe we should dismantle this architecture that we've built the internet upon, and it's a worrying time on that front. As somebody who works on the internet.
yeah.
Well, let's we only have a few minutes left, so take us home, Joe. Let's talk about hallucinations, this time not AI related.
Yeah, okay, so this is real quick, so this is good. So there was a case in New Jersey, a classic AI hallucination case. There were a bunch of sites that weren't, quotes that weren't matching up, and cases that were bad law. And, there was a big investigation of how did your Gen AI get out of hand and why didn't you? And it wasn't. It was apparently that they told the paralegal to do some stuff, and the paralegal didn't know any better and screwed it up, which drove home for me that yet again, it's actually kind of a funny one. I actually really enjoyed the real rationale because it was that the original draft had a series of good quotes, and the associate told the paralegal, yeah, but these quotes need to be from the Third Circuit. And the paralegal, rather than saying, let me go find law from the Third Circuit that says the same thing, was like, great, I'll just change the sites on all of them to Third Circuit sites. So that was the error. Anyway, the point, though, was it was just yet another reminder of a thing that we've all talked about many times on this show and agree with, which is the problem is not the technology. It is that aren't editing. And this was another instance. The lawyers did not look to make sure that all of these sites were real. And this is the sort of thing that, flew under the radar when people poorly managed their teams for years. But thankfully, because everybody is hyped up about generative AI and all scared about what it can do, we're finally starting to get some transparency on which lawyers are bad at editing.
Well, I think it's funny because that was a sycophantic paralegal is what it really was. Same mindset as the AIs. Oh, you want this? I'll make it exactly what you want.
What a great idea. Oh, you're right. Those weren't good quotes. I'm sorry. Let me try again.
Well, that is the easiest thing. Where I was like, oh, you want it from first second? Here you go.
Yeah. Yeah. That was apparently when it went down. And it was complicated because the associate who gave the initial instruction apparently left the firm at that point. So there was a breakdown where like the part like the where that person probably would have looked at it and been, no, 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 no. I don't think you get it. But they were no longer there. So yeah.
Ouch.
All right. Well, looks like we're out of time. Sorry if I shortchanged anybody this week. You can blame Bob when he gets back. Hopefully next week. Just send your complaints to Bob Ambrogi, not to me. But anyway, yeah, join us next week with hopefully we'll have Judge Reinhold as our face, as our sponsor, and then we'll take it from there.
Amazing.
Long, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye,
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Bye.
Okay, so I stop recording. Yes.